I'm Laura Lauder, co-founder with my husband Gary of the Socrates program here at the Institute, which is a young leaders seminar series, and we have programs here in Aspen as well as all over the country. I'm delighted to welcome you as well as our listening audience on Aspen Public Radio and our viewers on Grassroots TV. This new lecture series is generously sponsored by an endowment created for the Aspen Institute by trustee Bob Hurst and his wonderful wife, Soledad. Please join me in thanking them for this generous gift to the community. Tonight, we are fortunate to have Norm Ornstein, scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, with us to moderate this conversation. Dr. Ornstein is here participating in the Institute's Communications Policy Conference. It is my great privilege to introduce Governor Jon Huntsman, Jr. of Utah. Governor Huntsman has served our country in many leadership roles throughout his career, including 2 terms as governor and U.S. ambassador to Singapore and China. Our family has had a long relationship with the Huntsmans. John Sr. and my father-in-law, Leonard Lauder, went to Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania together a few moons ago. Governor Huntsman also attended Penn and served on the board of Penn with my father-in-law and my brother-in-law, William Lauder. In fact, our 2 families have inspired each other at Penn. The Lauders and the Huntsmans both established international business degrees at Wharton, one in the graduate school and one in the undergraduate school. The great institution of family business and philanthropy is at the bedrock of America, and our families deeply believe in bipartisanship and putting America before our respective parties. In 1991, President Reagan appointed a Democrat, Mike Mansfield, who was the Democratic majority leader in the U.S. Senate, to be ambassador to Japan. President Obama continued this tradition of appointing a highly distinguished member of the opposite party to a key diplomatic post in Asia by appointing Governor Huntsman to be U.S. ambassador to China. Our 2 families have also been deeply involved in cancer treatment and in research. The Huntsman Cancer Foundation and Cancer Institute at the University of Utah is best in class in the West. Our country is most fortunate to have the Huntsmans involved in every level of public service. They are indeed great Americans. Governor Huntsman's wonderful wife, Mary Kay, and they have 7 children together, 2 in the U.S. Naval Academy. It is our pleasure to welcome you all to the Aspen Institute and to Aspen. And now I give it over to Dr. Ornstein, and welcome to you both. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be up here at this podium with Jon Huntsman, whose full bio, of sorts at least, you have in the program, but it doesn't even do justice to the range of his career. I first met you actually when you were ambassador to Singapore, and I made a visit there, and you did a tour d'horizon of the region and its politics, and even back then I think you were 32 years old at that time. Now 52. I kind of remember 52, although it's a little dim, although I remember it more than I do yesterday, but that's another issue. So let's start right in, and I think we have to start with the world today and the question that I'm getting from everybody that I'm sure you are too. Paul Ryan, good choice, bad choice?
So you're going to get a Republican in deeper trouble than he's already in now.
Can you get in deeper trouble?
I doubt it. I doubt it. But Norm, it's an honor to be with you. Let me tell you that it's a privilege for the 2 of us to be here with you, and for all of you who have taken the time to turn out tonight. Our deep gratitude and thanks, wanting to hear from a has-been and all. I'm just I'm deeply touched by that. Time will tell, but here's my measure of it. Does it bring to the Republican fold people who are not today there? Well, it seems that we. So if you that
was a rhetorical question.
So if you stop to argue that politics is a whole lot about demographics, and in this country of 320 million people, we have an ever-shifting set of demographics. If you're not bringing new people into the party, if you're not reaching out to those who have been disaffected, those who feel passionately about certain issues that are kind of up for grabs, if you will, in other words, tacking a little bit toward the center, because that's where the election, I think, is won or lost. The Republican right will turn out. There's no question about that. Before Paul Ryan, maybe less enthusiastically, today more enthusiastically. But what are you doing to close the gap in Florida? What are you doing to close the gap in the suburbs of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia? If you can't win Pennsylvania, I'm not sure you can win the election. What are you doing in Ohio? So that will kind of linger out there and gestate for a while, and we'll get an answer to that question. But my instinctive reaction was, what does the demographic calculus look like? And are we bringing more people on board than we had the day before? Now, in all fairness, we've got to let the arguments be made, and they will be made, and I love the idea that it's now going to be an election that will be a lot more on ideas, on a vision, hopefully, for this country as opposed to personalities. I think we've had far too much of that. This nation is desperately in need of a conversation about our future. And no conversation about our future is going to be complete unless you can talk about the underlying numbers. You know, let me just put it this way and then I'll conclude. We have three deficits that we've got to deal with in this country, and now. One is an economic deficit, and until we start seeing our economic deficit as a national security problem, not just an economic problem, but a national security problem because you can't compete with debt that is at the levels it is today, then we're not making progress. Two, we have a trust deficit in this country. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to face up to the fact that people don't trust their institutions of power and their elected officials anymore. You've written about the trust level. In your book, you talk about 9% for Congress. Pathetic. And we have a confidence problem in this country, a confidence deficit. Now, that's completely something we can overcome. And the trust deficit is something we can overcome. But we've got to put forward some ideas that speak to structural reform in politics that is separate and aside from structural reform in economics. And I would argue we're not going to be complete as a nation until we tackle these three deficits. And then finally, the wrapping in which all of this needs to occur. I spent a lot of time on college campuses now that I'm retired from the presidential campaign, because I always like to get the views, the impressions, the attitudes of our young people. I think they tell us a lot about where this country's going. You find a whole lot of them that are unaffiliated. Not right, not left, but unaffiliated. I think that's probably the fastest growing party on college campuses. And when you look to them, you say, what's going around in their mind? And what are they thinking about our future? When I was at American U recently, I thought about when Kennedy spoke there in 1962, gave a very well-known, famous graduation speech, spring of '62. He talked about two things. He talked about the Soviet threat, and then he talked about nuclear weapons and the need for disarmament and what it would mean if we didn't take that seriously longer term. And I thought, as I stood before those kids, you know, a couple of generations later, if Kennedy were to come back and address these kids, he would be so shocked to see how this world has changed. We're not talking about the Soviet Union any longer. We're not really even talking about arms control, although Ken Edelman is here, he knows something about that issue. We're talking about proliferation, which is still an issue in certain corners of the world. I think what he would find that is so unusually dangerous in this nation today is how we've forgotten to come together as Americans. We don't do that anymore. We've forgotten what it means to put our nation first. We're all going to disagree on the pathway toward an outcome. But lost in this whole conversation is any sense of civility, any sense of respect, any shred of history, and where the parties have been able to benefit this nation in terms of our dialogue historically. And as a Republican, I like to go all the way back to Abraham Lincoln when I analyze the Republican Party, not back 20 years. And that's where we are. We're a nation that needs to cover those three deficits, and we need to do it in an overall environment that speaks to remembering that we're Americans first before we're Republicans, Democrats, or independents. And I don't think we're going to make a whole lot of progress until we can put that front and center in our minds.
Can we do a do-over and go back to New Hampshire?
I took third. I'm not sure I
That's
want
right.
to talk
Okay.
about that again.
That aside, you've already answered about 7 of the questions that I had down the road, but I'll keep going. And I want to address each of those deficits that you've talked about, I think I'll come back to the economic deficit because it's worth spending a few minutes talking about the competing plans, the Ryan budget, the tax issue, and all of that, and what it means to be a fiscal conservative as opposed to a conservative reformer, which is one of the things that we have on the table now. But a couple of other questions just about what's out there and in the news today. We've had a couple of reports, rumors, suggesting that you're going to be speaking at the Democratic Convention. Accurate? Not accurate? Premature?
This is a strange world in which we live. So I was standing on the football field in Annapolis at the U.S. Naval Academy where my son plays football. He's just getting out of plebe summer. You know, he's lost 20 pounds, he's been kicked around, and, you know, they were just getting into football practice. I got these frantic calls. I was sitting in the, you know, the bleachers, enjoying my son for a while, and frantic calls coming in. Why didn't you tell us you're speaking at the Democratic Convention? It's like, where did this come from? And then it dawned on me, we do live in a new age in terms of how we disseminate the news, which is a horrible thing, by the way. And that was, there was a right-wing blogger who decided that he'd heard it from reliable sources, reliable sources, unnamed, that I had taken an invitation to speak to the Democratic Convention. I haven't talked to anybody. I've not accepted an invite. I'm not going to any convention this year. And by the time I was able to respond, it had circulated through Breitbart News Agency, where it started, the Drudge Report, and then it goes to mainstream outlets from there, and I thought, where's the sense of responsibility in journalism? Aren't you supposed to get a call that you can legitimately provide an answer to before it starts making headlines? So there you have it.
Okay, that, and I bet you that we've knocked down that rumor for, what time is it? Maybe 3 minutes before it'll be back on the web. Now, just one other thing that's a lot of people have been talking about a bit, which is your dad, a great man, a great American, who was interviewed recently and chastised Mitt Romney for not releasing more years of his tax returns, referred back to his dad, who had done more. This actually came up again with the Ryan choice because Ryan admitted that they'd asked him for many more years of his tax returns to vet him for vice president than he will release for president. What do you think about both your dad speaking out and about the general point?
I think my dad's a man of great sensibility, and I love him dearly. And here's the standard I think we ought to be going by. If you want to run for President of the United States, first of all, let's recognize that we have a trust deficit in this country, and this trust deficit is not going to be adequately addressed until we become more transparent as candidates. Number two, I think it's probably fair to say that someone running for the office of the presidency ought to disclose the same amount of information that one has to disclose when they go through Senate confirmation. Because you're going to be making all these appointments to serve in high-level positions from Secretary of State right on through to the ambassador to Mauritius. Now, having been through Senate confirmation 3 times, I mean, I can give you a level of analysis about the scrutiny 20 years ago versus the scrutiny most recently, the paperwork that is stacked up to the roof today as compared to 20 years ago, the politicizing of the vetting process today versus 20 years ago, and then you say, why isn't we getting good people in politics? Why isn't that people aren't willing to stand up and say, yeah, I'm ready to put my country first? So let's go by that standard. Let's say that anyone willing to run for president should be willing to put forward at least the amount of information, and last I looked, what was required of those being confirmed by the Senate was more than 2 years' worth. So let's just use that as a benchmark.
And we can come back to one of the reforms that are necessary, which is to streamline the confirmation process so that maybe sane people will be willing to put themselves into that cauldron. Now let's talk a little bit about your campaign, painful as it might be to do so. You left a remarkable position as ambassador to China to come back and make this run for the Republican nomination. Are you comfortable that you made a good choice? And reflect a little bit on what happened after you made that choice.
Here's the analysis that went into our decision. Lived overseas 4 times. We knew when we took the job in Beijing that we would put in 2 years. That would be the length of the assignment, which we did. Why 2 years? Well, we're raising 7 kids, all of whom, or most of whom, were here in the States, graduating from programs, getting married, and we wanted to reconnect with our kids and family. And Beijing's a tough place in which to serve. We can get into that later. But it's a tough place in which to serve as a U.S. envoy. You're not always the favorite pick of the party, day in and day out. And so after 2 years, we decided to come back. And as we came back, you know, as someone who's been involved in public service and who loves this country, raising 7 kids, 2 boys in uniform, 2 girls adopted, 1 from China, 1 from India, you have a whole different perspective on this world. You say, okay, you can either sit it out or you can get in the arena, as Teddy Roosevelt used to talk about. The issues that were being discussed, tax reform, economic vitality, competitiveness, recognizing our place in the world, which I think is going to be an important part of the debate this election cycle. We haven't even gotten there yet. And I thought, given the wonderful opportunities that our family has had to serve, sitting it out would be unpatriotic. You might not win, but maybe you can help shape the debate. Maybe you can throw some ideas out there that will help inform the process and maybe shape priorities. And so we got in, based upon my view that it would have been unpatriotic to sit out an important election cycle. And people said, 2016, you know, why just wait it out, wait your turn. Same thing I heard when I ran for governor in 2004. You know, there's always a hierarchy in politics. There are always the people who are there and, you know, have the establishment with them, have the money, raise this, that, and the other. I heard that when I ran for governor in 2004 as well, in a state that needed an economic boost. And we made the arguments in our state of Utah. I'd never run for office before. I thought people who did that were nuts. And we ended up getting through a crowded primary, convention process, and I beat a guy named Scott Matheson, whose dad had been governor of the state of Utah, a man I respect enormously, both of them, the whole family. And I took the Democrat who I beat, and I assigned him to one of the most important commissions in our state after I won, because I thought it was important for our state to come together with a sense that we're putting the work of the state, the business of the state, before politics. And so similarly, when the 2012 election cycle came around, I thought, gee, we got some good things done in Utah. We got awarded the best managed state in America. We had the best performing economy as measured by job growth and unemployment. And I thought, you sit it out, you know, these are not 2016 issues, these are 2012 issues, they're on the burner today. So we jumped in, I have no regrets about that. But I did get a forewarning from Mary Kay as we started the process. She said, if you pander, if you sign any of those damn pledges, I will leave you. And I said, I kind of like my marriage more than I like politics. And here we are. And then as we progressed through the early months, you know, I wasn't real popular in Iowa because of some of the positions I'd taken. I was against subsidies and a few other things. And then folks started getting on television early in the race. One guy by the name of Michael Moore, who's a well-known personality in this country, he went on television one night and said, that Huntsman guy, he's actually a Republican I could support. And I could just feel our prospects in Iowa going from about 10% to 1%. And then Bill Clinton got on TV and said, that Huntsman guy, he seems pretty unhidebound. He's a Republican I could support. And then I knew we were toast in South Carolina. And on we went, pretty much digging a hole in New Hampshire, saying, if it doesn't happen here, it's not going to happen anywhere. And we moved up in New Hampshire. Ron Paul took a lot of the independents. Mitt had a formidable organization because he was a next-door neighbor and had run there before. And we were gaining in the days leading up to the primary. And I'm convinced, maybe I just want to feel good about our experience, that if we had another week or two, we would have done just great. And in my own mind, the threshold in New Hampshire was second place. We were asked repeatedly by the media, what do you have to do in New Hampshire? What are the expectations? I said, the marketplace will determine the expectations. We have to beat market expectations. That's the way a company works when it goes public and wants to remain viable as a public entity. It's how a politician remains viable. And if we do not exceed public expectations, it's not going to work out. To my own mind, that was second place, although I couldn't tell anybody. We fell just barely short, took third, and I knew at the time that we could trudge onward, but it was wasting everybody's time.
Of course, Ron Paul is for legalization of drugs and legalization of prostitution, and I must confess I rooted for him because I just wanted to be at the victory party.
Is that hold true for all of your AEI colleagues?
No. And I was careful not to say good things about you because I was afraid the same thing might happen, but that's another story. So as I watched the campaign, and thank you, Mary Kay, for what you did, but as I watched the campaign, the moment when I thought it was over for you was during a debate when you said something like, you know, maybe we should pay some attention to those scientists. And And it raises several larger points for me. A part of it is the deficits that we have, because if we don't get ahead of the game in technology and climate and in other areas, we're lost anyhow. But it also gets to a point that Jeb Bush, who nobody would accuse of being a rhino or Republican in name only, said just a few weeks ago, which is that he doesn't think in today's Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, if he were running on his record as president, or his father, George Herbert Walker Bush, could win a Republican nomination. Respond.
I worked for Ronald Reagan as a young man. Yeah. I was an advance man for Ronald Reagan in my early 20s. And I got to see him up close, both here and international. My first trip to China, although I'd lived in Taiwan in the late 70s, as my first stint abroad, was to China with President Reagan in the early 1980s. I think he'd be aghast today at the lack of civility in our discourse, at the cable channels barking at each other, and the complete polarization, and the fact that the middle has been blown out of the system. That's where you get things done, by the way. You know, the middle has always been where you take the handoff from right and left and synthesize it into saleable, doable public policy options for America. They're not there anymore. And so it's no wonder that we're not getting anything done. There's no one there to do stuff. You got people on the right wall and the left wall, and I think this is where President Reagan, who was a consummate deal maker, he'd bring people into a room and he'd strike a deal. Remember going to the Embassy of Ireland with him on St. Paddy's Day in Washington. Sitting in the backyard, he had a beer with Tip O'Neill. And together they talked about the affairs of state, respectfully, with the view in mind that we're doing this for Americans first and foremost. We beat each other up because we believe different things philosophically, but at the end we come together as Americans and we move forward an agenda for the American people. I think you would be absolutely taken aback by the lack of basic respect and civility in today's discourse. And I would furthermore tell you, Norm, that I don't know that the Republican Party can sustain any kind of future without a fundamental belief in empirical data and scientific research. Because so much of what we're doing now, geez, we're flying to Mars, for heaven's sake. You don't do that based on politics, you do that based on science, based on people crunching numbers. We raise our kids and say, go out and get a good education. Go as far as you can go. Like I tell my daughter Gracie, who's 13, she wants to be a doctor, she wants to be a scientist, and go find a cure for cancer, just like Laura's family's doing. That's what we aspire to as Americans, to push the envelope of science, to get to Mars, to find cures for human disease, to figure out what climate change is all about, how to deal with it realistically. And I don't know how you can have a public policy discourse that is completely divorced from science and empirical data. And so I thought it was important on that stage. Thank you. I thought it was important on that stage in the Reagan Library, where I was, over us was hanging that Air Force One 707 that I had flown on as a young advanced man. It was surreal. I mean, coming in as a relatively young person and seeing the plane you flew on in a museum. And I thought, it's important. It's important right here in the Reagan Library. And I just went on the Reagan Presidential Foundation board. I think Ronald Reagan leaves a legacy of leadership. Whether you agreed with his priorities or not, he leaves a legacy of leadership. And I thought it's important to state what I believe about the Republican Party. What would Abraham Lincoln be saying today about the party? He who believed in individual dignity, the worth of the individual. So somebody said, why are you in favor of civil unions? And I said, let me tell you why I'm in favor of civil unions. Because I think equality under the law is a fundamental American principle. And I think if Abraham Lincoln were here today, that's what he would say. And why are you talking about the environment and the land? Well, I grew up in California, governor of Utah. I grew to love the land, all the stuff we're at. I think the greatest legacy that we're handing down to the next generation is this thing called humanity. And humanity is kind of equal parts air we breathe, water we drink, land we share, how we treat one another, and our level of competitiveness on the world stage. That's the sense of humanity we pass down to the next generation. And I say, this land that we're on has a lot to do with. If Teddy Roosevelt were here, he'd be talking about this land and what we do about it. I got to tell you, on the campaign trail, it was a thrill to have Teddy Roosevelt IV out campaigning. You can take everything away from the campaign, but the fact that we had Teddy Roosevelt IV out campaigning with it was pretty cool. And then I think about Dwight Eisenhower. I think, yeah, for national security reasons, he built the interstate system, but where would we be today in terms of our competitiveness as a nation without our ability to link up all of us as people and the ability to sell and distribute goods? And Ronald Reagan brought into the Cold War. And I think that fundamentally transformed this world more than any other singular event during my lifetime. That brought a collapse of one ideology, followed a little bit by Deng Xiaoping opening the doors of China in 1978. The marketplace opened, and today we have 3.8 billion more consumers in the marketplace than we had before the world transformed itself. Many more opportunities for everybody in every corner of the world. So I think that science, getting back, Norm, to your original question, and sorry to deviate a little bit, if we can't sustain a focus on what science means to the future of this country and encourage and inspire our young kids to get us to Mars and to find cures for cancer and to leave this world a better place, I don't know how you make public policy otherwise.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about another question that also, as you answered it, I thought doomed your candidacy, which is on immigration. But before I get to that, since you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, I would suggest that if Teddy Roosevelt were here today, he would also be talking about the trusts and his concern there, and his alarm that the Tillman Act, which he supported, which was designed to greatly curtail the corrupting role of money in our politics, has been undermined. So talk a little bit about money. You encountered this directly in the campaign, and we see it now. Do you think we're moving in the right direction?
I think it's an abomination. You could get people of average intelligence in a room and ask them to design a campaign finance system for this country. And there is no way they would ever come walking out with what we have today. It's an embarrassment. And everybody knows it, and nobody wants to fix it. And now we've got it undergirded by law. You talk about it in your book. And wondering what to do. Super PACs are destroying politics. Money in politics is long-term corrosive. But here's what it does beyond just selling messages to candidates and taking messaging opportunities away from ordinary citizens. I think it heightens the bar for average Americans being able to enter politics. If you don't have money, if you don't have large funders who can organize around you, you're not going anywhere. So what does it say about our system if average Americans can't enter the political process and get out on a street corner, start a campaign, and move forward? I think anything that takes away from average citizens being able to become active and participate in our system is not a good thing longer term, and we've got to address it.
I think we could spend many hours on this, and I would be delighted to. And I want to come back in a minute just to some of the other ways to perhaps cure our ills or begin to turn things around. But I mentioned immigration. And Utah has provided a model for a more humane way to deal with the issue that I think embarrasses Arizona and other states that have chosen a different path. And you started by talking about whether a vice presidential nominee broadens the appeal of a party that, if it doesn't begin to appeal to a population of immigrants, may consign itself to a permanent minority status. What do you think about this issue and whether there's any chance of changing the climate?
We don't have an immigration problem anymore. Nobody's coming. Just look at the numbers. I mean, we are right now at a wash. If you look at the inflow and out migration, lowest numbers in 4 decades since the early 1970s. People are coming. The one thing that makes this country totally unique in the world, and I hear about it wherever I go and wherever I've lived, is our very unique capacity to absorb people from all over the world into our culture and to make them feel a part of the American experience and share in the American dream. And we benefit enormously from that power. Nope, it's just not a given that a country can take in people from different corners of the world, come from different religions, traditions, and cultures. Many have tried and failed. We do it in this country. And what was so discouraging about the message on the immigration side from 2008, and even now, because I stood separate and aside again from some of those running for president, and I wasn't about to change my position on it, is the shrillness of our conversation on immigration. Not only is heard by the Hispanic Latino communities, but is heard by those who came to this country a generation or so ago. Indian Americans, of whom there are 4, maybe 5 million in this country. Asian Americans, they heard the same message, and you know what? They walked off thinking the same thing. Yeah, I'm an immigrant too. That could have been me if the process hadn't worked out for me. So, having run the largest visa shop in the world, which is in China, we had a large embassy in Beijing, second largest in the world, and then 5 consulates around China. You could build baseball-size stadiums to process visa applicants, and you're still never going to keep up with the demand. 700,000 came to the United States last year. You look at the emerging middle classes of China and India and every other corner of the world. What do they want to do? They want to come here, travel and tourism to begin with, which is a great economic driver, by the way. That's a good thing. They want to come here to study in our schools. That's a good thing. And many of them want to stay behind and want to contribute brain power to the future of our economic engine, which is a great thing. And so we've got to fix the immigration part of it, which is to say, I can't, in my own mind, get around the idea that you can talk and talk and talk about building a wall, which is, okay, I guess, at some level, but then not recognize the 12 million who are here. Nobody wants to say the obvious, and that's we have 12 million here, we got to deal with it, realistically. You know, and the idea that you ship people back or self-identification or whatever, they're here. They're integrated into our systems and our communities. We have to deal with the reality of the situation. And that means recognizing it for what it is and coming up with some sort of, you know, temporary work status or something of the kind where we can begin to get people moving through the process, which when I was in Singapore processing Vietnamese refugees was about 12 months. And today it's about 12 years to get through the system. It's broken. That's where we are.
I've got so many more areas I want to cover, and I'm going to mention three that I'd like to bring up now. We want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and extend the session by 10 or 15 minutes so that we can get to some of these things too, if that's okay with people, and if it's okay with you, if it doesn't interfere with your plans for the evening. The first is on the fiscal crisis that we have, and you mentioned pledges, and I want to talk about that a little bit. The second is our political dysfunction and what we can do about it, and then the third is China. We can't leave without you having addressed some of those questions. So I'm going to just try and run through at least a few of those. The pledges. I believe, and have for some time, that the no tax pledge is at the root of a good deal of our difficulty now. And I just don't see how you can deal with the demographics in the country, which is a population that is both aging with people living longer, which means enormous burdens in long-term care and in other ways, with some of the demands in the country, including coping with the global economy, with the national security demands, without having enough revenue to cover what those basics are going to be. And that's going to be higher than the historical average of 18 to 20%. We actually got to 22% of GDP under Ronald Reagan. We're about 24 now. But revenues are at about 15. The Ryan budget makes a Herculean effort to balance the budget while reducing taxes, but in fact doesn't balance the budget under the most favorable assumptions until the mid-2030s, and adds about 11 trillion or so in debt up to that point. That's under the best of circumstances. We have other plans on the table that presumably would do better, but they're not being discussed all that much in the presidential campaign. So talk a little bit about what you think about a budget plan that would try and get us to fiscal sanity without any revenues, and one which makes all the Bush tax cuts permanent and then cuts a lot deeper.
Well, I had a pretty simple approach to all of this, and it's one that I did as governor when we delivered kind of a flatter tax in our state. Everybody kind of laughed at the beginning and said, there's no way you're going to reform the tax. And I did in my first year. We failed. But I did the second year. And my goal was to phase out every single loophole and deduction, every single one of them, and to phase out corporate welfare and subsidies, of which there are probably $90 billion worth when you add up all the subsidies that we have in this country. And then on a revenue neutral basis, you can deliver tax reform in a pretty significant way. Where did I get some of these ideas from? Some from what I did in our state, which allowed us to lower taxes on a revenue neutral basis and really flatten the income tax. But it left us a whole lot more competitive as a state. And people started taking note of the economic engine that started to emerge because we went through comprehensive tax reform. The way forward is pretty simple. It's called Simpson Bowles, or some variation on the theme. So I think the winner of the election will be the person who gets to Simpson Bowles fastest. You know, the more you run away from that kind of compromise, which is what the American public is looking for, I think the more you're going to stray from electability. And I think that's where the election is going to be won, plain and simple. Why? Because it's a solution, a roadmap, a pathway that was blessed on a bipartisan basis, which I think in today's world is very, very important. It begins to phase out these loopholes and deductions. Most Americans don't realize You know, $1.1 trillion per year in loopholes and deductions that affect about 7% of the U.S. population. And they're just renewed every year. No real oversight. They just continue. And it's just nonsense. I mean, at some point we're going to wake up and say, you want to fix the budget, fix spending and what government is focused on. Let's just begin to take that step. And Simpson-Bowles begins to address that, and I think that's very, very important. So that's where I think the fix is going to be found longer term with Simpson-Bowles. And you know what it would do? You know, you figure that after you're elected, and I found as governor, you've got a little honeymoon period. Sometimes it doesn't last long. But whether you have a re-elected president or a newly elected president, you're going to have a honeymoon period. And that's the time when you get folks together, hammer out a deal, and that's where something like this could get done. And the message that it would send to the marketplace about certainty, about predictability, not everyone's going to like it. That's the beauty of it. You know, it angers people whenever you talk about it because it takes a little bit here and a little bit there. But the certainty that it would infuse into the marketplace would see this economy jump. And the international markets would respond very favorably. And that's where I think we take the ship of state. We'll spend 2 or 3 months talking about it, and then you know what, first quarter of next year, this is where we'll be.
So, of course, Simpson-Bowles, Rivlin Domenici, the Gang of Six inside the Senate all came up with the same template. The dysfunction in the process, the tribalism, kept us from reaching any of those conclusions. You were kind enough to mention my book a couple of times called It's Even Worse Than It Looks, which, by the way, makes a great holiday gift.
Signed or unsigned?
That's right. And I'll sign, no problem there. And that means any holiday, bar mitzvahs, weddings. But I came to the conclusion in over 40 years of being inside the belly of the beast in Washington that I had never seen it this dysfunctional, and we operate with a lot of dysfunction. You're younger and you haven't been around quite that long, but you've been around the track at the state level and at the federal level. Have you ever seen it this bad? And beyond doing something to fix the money system, doing something to make it easier for people to come into public life, given that so much of this is a cultural problem now, what can we do to restore a culture of problem solving?
So here's what we have, to my mind. We have the trust deficit, which has turned everybody off to politics. You know, in the old days when my grandfather was principal of Los Altos High School in California, you know, he had a picture in his little living room by the front door of Lyndon Johnson. And on top of that, he had John Kennedy. He was a Republican. Yet he looked to those people who were leaders at the time as unifying forces in America. How is it that we get back to that unifying force in America? You've got to have some disruptive event in Congress that brings people off their respective walls. So you need a point of defection, in my opinion, where people can say, yeah, it's a pretty good idea, but do I have the courage to go there? Do I have the courage to leave the party apparatus, which has told me I have to be here, and defect to this point? There's no point of defection right now in Congress, so there's no unifying force. I think that's going to happen somehow, some way, whether it's an alternative movement of some kind. But those are always very hard, and structurally they're almost impossible in this country. The one thing we've got to do, and it was pretty apparent to me in the 2008 election when I was reelected, we looked at the numbers for the young people turning out to vote, and they were way down. And I thought, this is long-term deleterious for this state and for the nation. If the young people aren't energized about turning out to vote, so the bottom line to the exercise, folks, is how do we shift around the system to maximize voter turnout and participation? This is kind of how we get an answer longer term. It's unacceptable for young people not to turn out. It's unacceptable for responsible adults who care about the issues not to turn out and vote. Yet we have states that have these kind of small, very exclusionary convention and primary processes. I've been through some of them. And most people don't know that they're even taking place, and they don't know how to get involved, and they don't have the time to go out and turn out a neighbor. They just want to vote. They just want to cast a vote for the right person. That, to my mind, is longer term what is going to begin this nation churning once again. You've got to get broad-based voter turnout, people who are passionate about the issues, who are willing to get out and vote and participate.
What, just on that front, what do you think about moving election day to the weekend, doing some things that would make voting easier instead of throwing impediments in the way?
Well, why is it that we're tied to the one date that we have today? Why is it that the school year is tied to the old 1850s agrarian calendar? I used to ask that all the time as governor. You know, I've lived in Taiwan twice, I've lived in Singapore, I've lived in China. I see how these kids are being educated. You know, it's year-round. And in our state and every other state, you know, kids get the summer off because that's when they used to go work the farms, you know, 150 years ago, and still we're doing the same thing. And so why here? We need to start asking why. What is it based on, and how is it better serving our nation and preparing us for tomorrow? If it's not maximizing voter turnout and participation, it's wrong. Then it's a barrier to entry.
That was the right answer. So let's talk for a couple of minutes. Actually, I do want to raise one other thing. Bob Bennett is a friend of mine and a friend of yours, and it was that primary process and convention process that knocked him down basically because he was a problem solver. Richard Lugar lost for many reasons, but not the least was he was somebody who believed in compromise, and his opponent who beat him in the primary said, my idea of compromise is they come to where we are or we beat their heads in. We're getting more of that happening now. Are there other ways, open primaries, preference voting, some other things that you think might work to try and move us past a point where a small minority of fringe ideologues can dominate this process?
An open primary turnout is absolutely the thing that we ought to be moving to. So if you stop to think in the state of Utah, there's a convention system in which you've got about 3,500 delegates turning out who really do determine the national leadership from our state and also the governorship. 3,500 who basically determine the outcome. That's not, to my mind, democracy in action. That needs to happen. But I also believe that the whole notion of trust needs to be ratcheted up. This nation needs a conversation on how we regain trust in government. And here's another thing that struck me as really difficult during the campaign process. So after 1,000 town hall meetings at different places, everyone today seems to have their own data, their own information. People stand up, you know, gee, Governor, what do you do about health care? Because here's the truth about health care, you know, and I say, where are those numbers coming from? Or here's the truth about China or somewhere, and I say, in order to have a decent debate in this nation that will take us in the direction of informed public policy, you got to start with real data, real information on which you can have that discussion. And it's a real concern of mine today that everyone seems to be parking in their own little alleyway or cul-de-sac of life and feeding from whatever website suits their respective ideology. And they develop informed opinions about where this country ought to go. And I don't know how you bring people together around real information and data. That's a real problem, and I think that there's a real role for universities and colleges to play in this nation as it relates to being the primary providers of reliable data and information. It's got to have the imprimatur of respected people before you can even enter into the political debate on which you then make public policy. We're not there. I don't even know how we can make public policy going forward. You've got so much random information out there that people cling on to. You want to present the truth or the facts, have nothing of it.
I'm cognizant of the time. What I'm going to do is ask you a series of questions about China and then just have you give one answer, picking whichever ones you want. And then
sounds like the debate.
That's right. And then we'll turn to at least a little bit of audience participation. As I was thinking about China and thinking about you, I was thinking first, we have Governor Romney trying to draw a sharp distinction in policy with the Obama administration, saying that from day one he would take a very hard line on China, on trade and on currency. And I wanted to get your reflections on that and whether that's campaign rhetoric that would change on day one when you realize realities, or whether he has a point. A second is the delicacy that we have now in dealing with China, where you can't separate out one issue because everything is interrelated. And we have interests, very strong interests, in policy towards Iran, Syria, North Korea, and China can either be an adversary blocking our ability to act in the way we want, a neutral party that at least doesn't intervene, or a partner. And how do we get that to come about, especially if we try and compartmentalize that from some of the other areas like trade and currency, where we want to view it in a different way. A third is the show trial going on now and what that tells us about China and China's leadership. And then finally is the big one, which is as China's growth slows, it poses challenges not just to the global economy, but to China's leadership and any movement towards or away from some semblance of civil society and democracy. So pick which ones of those you want to address.
When Kissinger went to China in 1972, 71 preparing the way for Nixon, in 72 Fred Malek was there in a key role in the White House at the time. And I was discussing this with Dr. Kissinger. We were both in India speaking at a conference a few months ago. And he was kind of lamenting, you know, where's the grand strategy? You know, we used to have strategy, you know, in the old days for the United States. Where's our strategy? You know, what is the big picture? And I reflected on the strategy of his in 1972. And my friends in China referred to it at the time, 中国准备进入世界象, China preparing to enter the world. And I traveled there with Reagan in the early 80s. I was trade ambassador when we got them into the World Trade Organization. And at the time, they used to say about themselves, 中国进入世界象. China formally entered the world in 2001 when they entered the WTO. And then going to Beijing this last time, living there as U.S. ambassador, what you're struck by is this relationship has arrived. Two countries on the world stage, the United States and China. You either deal with that reality and the complexities of that reality. It's not a bilateral relationship anymore. It's a global relationship. You can't have a conversation with Wen Jiabao or Xi Jinping or Hu Jintao or Wang Qishan or any of them without talking about the economy of Europe and the role that China's going to play, about talking about proliferation or weaponization in Iran, or stability on the Korean Peninsula, or peace in the South China. You can't have any of these you can't sit down without covering the waterfront. It's a global relationship. And either we see it for what it is, a very complex mosaic of interrelated themes and issues in which both countries have major interests. If you disrupt one of them without thinking through it, you disrupt the whole series of issues that fall behind it. I know that because I've sat in countless negotiations on every one of these issues with the Chinese. And you move a little bit in this direction, they'll move a little bit there. And so what comes across as pretty good rhetoric and to get people fired up, yeah, I'm going to declare war on China when I'm elected president, instead the crowd whoops it up. I'd stand on the stage and cringe. I'd say, but that's not how the world works. And I'd give a rendition of how the relationship, not a clap in the room, you know, come on, get that guy off the stage. But here's the reality too, you know, when I went with Reagan in the early 80s, the Mao-suited bureaucrats at the Central Planning Commission, they couldn't even afford to send their bureaucrats abroad. Deng Xiaoping was on the stage, door opening to the world, diplomatic openings, primacy of the party. He was trying to maintain primacy of the party, which is the legacy Deng leaves behind, and his dynasty now comes to an end with the rise of Xi Jinping. And I compare and contrast that. Not an English speaker among the bureaucrats in Beijing. I could crack the code, fortunately, as a Chinese speaker. But I compare it to my meetings in the foreign ministry more recently. Suits, English, talented bureaucrats who have been to the finest schools in the world, on top of their game. And I say, they know everything about the United States. They know every subtle nuance of our system. You can't find a person in Congress who knows anything about China. And so I say, if we're going to take them on, and you have to stand up, the most powerful weapon we have is our values, and we forget that sometimes. What they fear most in Beijing is our clear and consistent articulation of democracy, freedom, liberty, human rights, and open markets. That's who we are. That's the brand that we have in the world. So I compare and contrast the old China to the new, and I say, you want to pick a fight, make sure that you have leverage. Whether you do deals, whether you acquire companies, whether you're doing a trade negotiation, you got to have leverage. The United States has no leverage in the relationship today. So they'll hear the words and they'll say, well, that's okay. You can do whatever you want, but you know what? You're manipulating your currency too through quantitative easing. And if you're going to get us, we're going to get you. And I remember that distinctly from the tires 421 case that President Obama launched shortly after he was elected. I was new in Beijing, but as a former trade ambassador, I remember ringing up the trade ambassador or the Secretary of Commerce, one of them saying, this is not a good thing. I understand the politics behind it, not a good thing because we're going to get something in return. It went through, they announced it. Well, within a matter of days, I think it was, I think the tires case, our voluntary restraint on their tires coming into the United States, was worth about $2.7 billion. They imposed punitive measures on our chicken parts, worth about $2.7 billion. And I say, this is the yin and yang in today's relationship. They like complete, as they call it, a ping ping heng heng de 这个关系, a perfectly
I say that all the time.
a perfectly harmonious affair. So you hit here and they'll hit there. We have no option. We have to sit down and we have to forge a growing-up relationship with China. And we have to put our interests on the table and say, folks, this is the relationship of the 21st century. There is no other that will shape the generations to come, economically, militarily, culturally, and every other way. And you've got to get it right, and so do we. Now, here are our interests in the Asia-Pacific region and the world. Let's hear yours. And let's begin to figure out how step by step we can build confidence. That's hard to do. But getting back to how Kissinger brought it about in the early 70s, we had shared interests. It was called the Soviet Union. And it brought us together. 1972, folks, when Nixon went, we were fighting them in Vietnam, the Chinese. We had fought them a generation earlier on the Korean Peninsula. They lost 400,000 men. Mao Zedong's son is buried in North Korea. The throes of the Cultural Revolution. Zero trade, zero people, and into that fray came one Richard Nixon. Can you imagine the President of the United States doing that today? Pulling off the impossible, a grand, bold, balance of power move, and change the world. It was done based upon shared interests. We have a whole lot of shared interests with China. They haven't been fully articulated, and that will be up to the new generation of leaders to be able to do that and set us in the right direction.
Was terrific, which also explains why we should have a week's conversation with Jon Huntsman and not just an hour. I do have to say, on the notion of Congress in China, one of my favorite moments in the "you can't make this up" category was a Republican, actually it doesn't matter which party, a congressman from Pennsylvania on the Foreign Affairs Committee when we were discussing whether we would intervene in Libya said, I kid you not, if we go into Libya, what's next? Are we going to go into Africa?
Well, he had the same geography teacher as certain other politicians.
Well, I said you can understand why he's not on the Intelligence Committee, but that's another matter. Can we take a few minutes? We have microphones for a few questions, if Governor Huntsman will give us a little more time than he committed to. And please identify yourself
quick question.
And make it a quick question, yes.
Stefan Edlis, I just want to know, I was a good customer of your dad, bought a lot of polystyrene.
I may have sold it way back when.
To make Motorola flip phones.
Oh yeah, of course.
Quick comment. I'm waiting for my tax cut so I can buy my next Jeff Koons. And that's supposed to be a laugh line. I'm not getting
Yes.
any laughs. What are your views on the increasing income disparity in this country?
I think the income disparity that we face is creating a major social division in this nation that is long-term dangerous and unsustainable. I also think some of the great historic events of my lifetime that I've watched played out are leaving behind another dangerous trend that is going to result in social distortions in this country. It's called structural unemployment. So what has moved this nation and this world about as much as anything? It's been the impact of social media, communication technology that you would know about, on capitalism. We're faster, we're smarter. You know, I chair a cancer institute that Laura talked about earlier. I've seen what genetics is doing and where it's going to take us. And I say we do all these things that are incredible today, but it's also leaving behind a disequilibrium socially. So you have movements that are beginning to form all over the world, occupy this and occupy that. Why? Well, you look at the creation of certain industries recently. I mean, Apple, we've all been moved by Apple. They've transformed music, books, publishing, music. So $128 billion in stuff that they make every year. And 64,000 employees. I think the sales from Apple 2 quarters ago represented 20% of this nation's retail sales. 20%, one company. And I say their efficiency metrics are probably 3 to 4 times better on a per employee basis than any other company in America. So if you look at sales to employee ratio, it's about 2 million per employee. You compare and contrast that to McDonald's, which did, I don't know, $30 billion in sales, 60,000 employees. Apple's 30% more efficient when you break it down on an employee per revenue basis. And I would have to say that our future, and Mr. Isaacson knows a whole lot more about the subject, he's the expert. I think our future will see a whole lot more in the way of apples than the less efficient businesses cropping up. So they keep a whole lot of people employed in China. Foxconn is the name of the company. They'll be robots before you know it. And so left behind is this, and it strikes me as being one of our most significant issues on the horizon, structural unemployment. And the social implications of structural unemployment, they're real. And we've got to have some public policy solutions and options that deal with that which we used to do pretty well in this country. I call it vocational skill development, workforce training. We somehow lost connection with that a couple of generations ago. We don't do it anymore. I tried to do it as governor. We could talk about that another time. But we've got to educate and bring up a whole new generation of people who know how to run manufacturing. You know, I think this nation is on the cusp of a manufacturing renaissance if we play our cards right. But I do believe longer term, these are social implications of probably the most profound historic data points in my lifetime that are playing out under our feet. And we have to understand not just the economic implications, but the societal implications as well. And not be afraid to say, we don't want a country divided beyond repair.
Who has the microphone? Okay, go. We've got a question over there. Again, identify yourself.
Skippy Mesro. Throughout the campaign and tonight, you have enumerated policy positions that could find a home in any number of political ideologies. And as far as I know, you've always self-identified and run as a Republican. So my question is, what is it in what you perceive to be the Republican Party platform that makes you say, I am a Republican?
Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, General Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, the list goes on and on. So I say, I'm not a Republican that draws from 10 or 15 years of history. I go back to when the party, Fremont failed in 1856, but Lincoln did okay in 1860. And I say, I want the Republican Party to be back where it defined bold, confident solutions for this country, and that presented them in the form of a vision, where we go, and did it in a way that always spoke to being Americans first and foremost, before being a party. That's where I want the Republican Party to go, and I think it has every capability of getting back. I do, because those are our roots. And if you look at the trajectory of parties, they go back and forth, they lose a little steam, they gain some steam, they have leaders rise up who can re-inject a little bit of energy and ideas into them. But parties today, I think, sadly, are pretty much a holding company for fundraising events and conventions. And they don't have the punch, the content that was so important, that at least the content that I grew up with. And I'm hoping that it returns.
Yeah.
Is it absolutely necessary for the United States to keep standing armies in Korea and Japan and Europe?
Well, I think it has to be looked at based upon, one, the national security posture of those regions, and two, the economics, and three, the politics. So if we stop to say that, we still have, 50 or 60 individual installations in Germany, I have to say, folks, the Russians aren't coming anymore. At some point, we have to deal with the reality of a rising Asia-Pacific region, which is 2/3 of our trade, and it's where the rising militaries are going to be. And it's where most of our American interests, economically and from a security standpoint, lie. And so Korea, I would say, we need a presence in Korea because you have North Korea. And you have to have lived in Beijing to see how so much of the stability in the region is based upon America's presence. The most powerful tool we have in our arsenal, believe it or not, was the USS George Washington. The USS George Washington steams through the LOC, and everybody pays attention. Nobody can do that. Nobody can project power and what that power means other than the United States. So would I reliably get a call into the foreign ministry and a shakedown whenever the George Washington came close to the port of Qingdao or Dalian? Of course. In Japan, now here's where politics gets in the way. When our base called Futenma, which is a military marine base, 10,000 Marines, becomes the sole issue on which the mayoral contest was run in the cities within Okinawa, then you say we better recognize reality. And that is we have to have a proper balance that provides security, that keeps the alliance maintained, which is an extremely important alliance, but also recognizes the shifting political winds. And I think the future in the Asia-Pacific region will see a whole lot more in the way of burden sharing, a whole lot more in the way of individual outposts. Maybe not as land heavy as we are in Korea with 35,000, or in Japan with maybe 40,000. It will be spread throughout the region. And it's interesting because you've got a whole lot of people in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 nation states of 600 million people, who are now inviting us because of the rise of China's military. So I think this provides a new opening and new opportunities for the United States to be able to take our footprint and update it just a little bit.
We'll take one more question over here, and then I think we'll have to call it quits.
My name is Fran Corsello, and I have a wish, Governor Huntsman, for your next job. Hillary Clinton has said no matter what happens, she is tired and she's going to step down as Secretary of State. With your experience internationally, and with China, our most important relationship, if you were invited to be the Secretary of State, will you please say yes?
Remember, my wife said, no pandering, no pledges, or I'll leave you. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.